Good afternoon, everyone. Welcome to the ISAS seminar titled Geoeconomics, Trade and Technological Conflict in the Indo-Pacific, India's Interests and Perspectives. Today's seminar will examine the impact of the ongoing trade and technological wars between the United States and China in India's extended neighborhood, while also looking at India's interests, prospects, and policy responses. The event is being live streamed on the ISAS Facebook page today. We're delighted to have with us as a guest speaker, Mr. Nitin Pai, co-founder and director, Takshashila Institution, India, and non-resident senior fellow at ISAS. The session will be chaired by Dr. Karthik Nachiyappan, research fellow at ISAS. Dr. Nachiyappan, please.
Great, thank you, Ramita. Good afternoon, thank you so much for joining us. It's my pleasure to welcome Nitin Pai, co-founder and director of the Takshashila Institution in Bangalore, to ISAS and NUS. Nitin is no stranger to Singapore or to NUS, where he studied, and he's worked in Singapore for many years. Broadly, Nitin's research and writing spans a few critical areas: India's role in the world, India's rise, what India is doing in the Indo-Pacific, and also on tech issues like space and cyber, which now matters to India's defense and security outlook. Today, he's going to talk to us about a topic that's very relevant to discussions here in the Indo-Pacific, geoeconomics, and how major powers are using economic instruments like trade, investment, and technology to bolster national power, to boost growth, and to compete strategically with their rivals. There's a general sense that the world that we live in now has entered a new geoeconomic era in which the domains of economics and security are no longer distinct, but are increasingly entangled, particularly with respect to investment, trade, and technology. And this geoeconomic order is being shaped above all by tensions between China and the United States. And these tensions, as I mentioned, have led to a blurring of national security and international economic policy, such that national security issues and justifications are now increasingly driving economic policy, while economic policy is increasingly seen as a domain of security and a part of strategic competition today. And important in this geoeconomic context is to get a sense of whether and how India could also play this geoeconomic game. India's economy has been rising and is expected to rise for the foreseeable future. And the economy going ahead could give the government in Delhi a powerful tool, a mechanism to manage tensions, to deal with other powers, and to advance its own strategic interests. So the big question is whether India can and play the geoeconomic game, and how can it do that? And I'm very happy here that we have Nitin here to talk about these issues. So Nitin will probably speak about 20, 25 minutes, and then we'll open it up for the Q&A. Nitin, over to you.
Thank you. Thank you, Karthik. I'm delighted to be here at NUS and ISAS. Part of it is to assuage a guilt that I had ever since I signed up to be a non-resident fellow. I looked at my contributions to ISAS and said, look, it seems to be negligible. I better make some corrections quickly. Otherwise, I'll look sort of like a freeloader or a free rider on ISAS. But the topic I picked is something which I did after looking at what ISAS has been doing for the last few years. And I thought there's a hole that needs to be plugged in the research community here. And I thought I'll share some views, share some ideas which might trigger avenues of research, further study for all of you. Because moving forward, I think what I'm going to talk about the next 10 years or more is going to be largely about these kind of issues, not the traditional issues that we've seen in the past, right? Now, disclaimer, my office and home is 2,200 kilometers from New Delhi. So that's how distant we are from the corridors of power. But Bangalore is also where the tech industry is located. So a lot of the technology part of India's geopolitics, in a way, comes from Bangalore, right? And it's centered around Bangalore. But I speak for myself. I don't even speak for the Takshashila Institute. I just speak for myself. I thought I should share this with this community, not giving you a government line, not giving you a counter-government line, but as far as possible an independent line to help you to think about these issues. Now, first, let me just locate where we are, in this world, where we are, where India finds itself, what are India's concerns, and then how India is going about addressing those concerns, right? So in that sense, it's a very positive, it's a not a normative conversation. And then we'll do the Q&A. I think the Q&A can take up a lot of time. Okay. The world is in the middle of three tectonic shifts, right? One is the shift of balance of power from the west to the east, predominantly pushed by China, but also other economic and political entities in the east. The second is the world entering the information age. Lo and behold, in the last 20 years, we find ourselves in the information age. We are not in the industrial age. And a lot of the frames which you use to analyze geopolitics in the industrial age don't apply in the information age at all, right? So you've got to use the frame of the information age. And the third tectonic shift is the consequences of people being in the information age, the cognitive consequences, right? What it means for the way people think, what does it mean for their political choices, how do they identify themselves as members of society, and what kind of politics does it create, right? So if you look at these three tectonic shifts, you will see that what you are witnessing is not so much a US-China contestation, but really a contestation between two information orders, right? Two information systems. One is an open and a free system. The other is a closed and a commanded system. So you have two information orders, right? Once you put names of countries there, you sort of take sides. But if you look at it analytically, there are two information orders. And the two information orders will contest with each other because there are lines of divergence between the two. So you will have contestation. And the trade war is just one manifestation of that. It's, I think, misleading to look at the trade war and its consequences and say, hey, the GDP of the United States fell only by about 0.5%, China's 0.5%, global GDP 0.3% down. So the trade war is not a big deal. The trade war, in terms of its consequences to trade, might not be a big deal. But its consequences to geopolitics, to the way we order our societies, to the way we do international economics, is profound. Massive changes across the world, right? So let's not just, I've talked to trade economists, and the trade economists will tell you, 0.5% here, GDP growth here and there. It's not a big deal. It is a big deal, right? Beyond the trade and the economics part. Technology is the most important front in the trade war, prospectively, right? You could look at agricultural products. Currently, agriculture is a big issue between China and the United States in terms of the trade balance. But that's the story of the past, right? The story of the future is really about technology and the way it changes geopolitical power of nation states. And true enough, nations are using geopolitical power to create technological power and using technological power to promote geopolitical power, right? So it's a two-way process. And this is the story of the next 10 years, at least. And if technology is this, this is, where does India find itself, right? Let's talk about the last 2 to 3 years, maybe 4 to 5 years. The first thing which happened is that India found itself challenged by the China-led information order, right? Let's call it the Sinosphere, where there was an attempt to create an internet in terms of content, infrastructure, services, denominated by Chinese interests and Chinese political values. When I say Chinese, I'm talking the People's Republic of China, right? So I'm using China as a short form, Chinese and China as a short form for the People's Republic of China, knowing fully well that the Communist Party of China is not necessarily the Chinese state in general, nor is it representative of the people, right? So it's the PRC's interests. And we had problems with that, right? We're contending surveillance economy, massive thefts of data, cyber warfare, information warfare coming through in that. That's number one. The second thing India finds itself is at the increasing political power of Western technology platforms. So until Elon Musk came and started doing his thing last year, and after he started doing his thing last year, I don't have to persuade anyone that, owning a technology platform is a political power, right? It's largely political power. And, I was having a conversation with some US senators a few weeks ago, and I was telling them that, look, it's not an antitrust problem. Like the political system in the US looks at these platforms and says, oh, these guys are like AT&T, right? These are huge commercial establishments, they have market power, and we need to break market power using antitrust. I said, you can't use antitrust to solve your problem, because the problem you have is not market power, it's political power. All these platforms have political power. They can influence elections in your countries, they can influence policies in your countries, and they're unelected people. We have the problem too, right? So if any sovereign country will have a problem, especially if these platforms are owned and operated by people who are outside your jurisdiction. So that was the second issue. And the third is a manifestation of the Russia-Ukraine war. Now, many of you might have noticed that soon after the United States imposed sanctions on Russian entities, a large number of US technology companies decided to switch off, their Russian business, Russian systems, Russian services, turn off the switches on turn off the lights in the houses of their Russian clients. I'm using this metaphorically. And what does that tell you? If you're a sovereign state anywhere, you say, look, I have an iPhone and I'm using iCloud. Do I want my iCloud access to depend on Washington's relationship with my government, right? If, let's say, Washington and New Delhi fall out of love one day, will I still get to use iCloud? Do I want to be in a situation where my essential services are, at the mercy of a political relationship which can change? So these are the three broad concerns I think India felt. And when I say India, it's not just the government of India, it's Indian industry, it's Indian intellectuals, people of India, civil society, everybody, right? To various forms, we felt that, look, these are the three big challenges we have to contend. China and the Sinosphere, political power of multinational platforms, and the reliance on the political risk coming from using cloud services which are controlled by Western companies. In that sense, I think towards the end, I think it was a self-goal on the part of the US companies to do this to Russian companies, right? Because now nobody trusts them. Nobody wants to keep your essential systems on clouds which depend on relationship with the West. Okay, so these are the three things. So what's India's response? There are lots of things happening, but if you want to characterize India's response, they fall into two categories. One is building strength. The other one is managing risk. What do I mean by this, right? Let me give you examples. So if you look at this technology war, I like to see, I come from a technology background. I used to work for the technology regulator in this country. So in a sense, for me, this is back to my old job. But if you look at the technology war, it's being fought on 5 fronts. The first one, at the lowest level, we engineers will call this lowest level, but you just want to look at it that way. The lowest levels are semiconductors, right? The stuff that makes everything work. Above that, the second lowest level is infrastructure, network infrastructure, which is hard infrastructure, soft infrastructure. Third level is operating systems. Fourth level are platforms, and the fifth level is content, right? So there are 5 fronts in this technology contestation. Now, let me give you the example of this. India's response is either building strength or managing risks. They are non-exclusive categories, but broadly, look at semiconductors. The Quad is a vehicle for India to build strength on semiconductors. Everybody knows that India's semiconductor capability is way below what its technology capabilities in other domains, right? Software, services, advanced kinds of software. The most mind-blowing kind of life sciences happens in and around Bangalore. But semiconductors has been a weakness, right? Manufacturing semiconductors has been a weakness. So how does India respond to this? They said, look, we've got to have some capability. So, $5 billion has been committed to build a wafer fab in the north. But building a wafer fab is not, I don't look at it as a way that, we are going to replace Taiwan or somebody and start making semiconductors of India. No. I think the idea is to build a facility in India which allows Indian engineers, trained managers, students to get a hang of how the semiconductor industry works. Now, where is this technology coming from? It's coming from the Quad. So the United States, Japan, and Australia are key partners in the semiconductor game, right? So you're trying to create what, in my words, bubbles of trust. So you have a great degree of trust with the United States, Japan, and Australia, because your interests, your values, and your economic complementaries converge. So that's why there's a bubble of trust with the Quad and with no other country, right? So semiconductors is the way. Now, how about building? So it's building strength. When it comes to network infrastructure, it's a combination of building strength and managing risks, right? Now, you might have, I don't know how many of you followed this, but in the middle of the pandemic, the government of India liberalized space policy, right? Today, you can set up a company in India and send a rocket into space. 1 year before that, I know because we were working, as Takshashila, we were working on space liberalization. Everyone in Delhi told us that, look, it's not going to happen. Space liberalization is going to be 10 years away. It's not going to happen. The vested interests are so strong. There are a lot of national security dimensions to this. There's a self-reliance dimension to this. Liberalization is not going to happen. Don't waste your time. Yet, within a year and a half, we had full liberalization of the space industry, right? Why did that happen? One important underlying thing is because space creates information infrastructure. It's hard infrastructure, right? You need to have enough capability to put satellites in space, and you need to have constellations of satellites in space which are not necessarily controlled by other entities, right? So you need to have some. So the decision to liberalize space, in part, has to do with a strategic sense that you have to de-risk. You have to de-risk your space segment. It's to do with also, for example, not buying Chinese equipment from mainland China vendors for your 5G rollout, right? You buy it from open source, Open RAN, you buy it from other vendors and so on. So network infrastructure, there is also managing risks. Operating systems, it's largely an area of cyber warfare. Let's not get into that. That's a lot of commercial IT. But platforms and content are also interesting, right? In platforms, there is an attempt to encourage domestic platforms, and there's also an attempt to manage the risks coming from foreign platforms. India was one of the first countries to ban TikTok, I think. And I think it was a well-justified decision because you were never in a level playing field with respect to the People's Republic of China, right? Because it was never free trade. The Indian technology and content companies were cut off from the Chinese market. So the Great Firewall might be seen as censorship by many, but it's actually a trade barrier because if you have content which you want to sell across the other side, you just can't because it's shut out for political reasons. So banning TikTok, creating alternatives is part of it. But the biggest story is in terms of public digital infrastructure. Like digital public infrastructure, DPI. Things like UPI, which is a payments infrastructure. There's a health infrastructure which is built on it. COVID ran, the CoWIN application ran on some of these things. Now, the model here is it's called open, but it's not open source. It's open in the sense it's available to other entities to participate, but it's not open. The code is not out there. So there's some tension with the open source folks saying that, you can't call it open. But it's open in a political sense. It's open in an economic sense. And that platform is now really mature. It's I think UPI transactions are more than MasterCard and Visa transactions around the world. I think every month the UPI platform does more transactions than MasterCard and Visa around the world. So pushing that kind of platform is also, part of the building strength and managing risk. And then, of course, there's content, which I think is the trickiest part, because as a liberal democracy, India cannot ban content, right? It's not, the government of India or the people of India are not in the business of controlling the minds of people and building ideological frontiers which you have to defend. But how do you tackle information warfare? Right? How do you tackle cognitive warfare? How do you tackle the ability of hostile and not so hostile entities to influence people's minds strategically, making use of the open content system? So that's the tricky one. It's hard for an open democracy to do this, nor should an open democracy try to muck around with content, but it is a consideration, right? So if you're sitting somewhere in New Delhi, especially you're looking at national security, this is a consideration going on in your mind. How do we deal with this? So this is how India is dealing, right? Just end with, what does it mean for countries of Southeast Asia, right? Now, all of us wish, well, when I say all of us, it includes me, I wish that India would engage in multilateral trade arrangements which are happening in this part of the country. We were the ones who were complaining when India stepped out of CPEC, not CPEC, RCEP and the others, right? So now there's an attempt to come back into the game. I think it's in India's interest to come back into the multilateral system, but it's not going to happen, for the asking, right? And I don't think, waiting for that to happen is a sound strategy on the part of Southeast Asian economies. I think the best way to deal with it is to deal with India bilaterally and understand where the opportunities are in building strength and managing risk. So if you're a Southeast Asian economy, if you're an Indo-Pac economy, you look at where India is building strength, you look at where India is trying to manage risk, and then say, what's the role we have? How do we make use of this? Because trying to, I look at it, when an elephant has decided which way it wants to go, I don't think you can stand around and try and guide the elephant and say, you've got to go in this way or that. You just let the elephant go where it's going and make use of that opportunity to get what you want, rather than to try and, remote control an elephant, which you can't, right? And in the technology space, at least, India is not a bystander in this. Is not a bystander or an affected party in the global contestation between two information systems. India is a player, right? And it sees itself as a player. It's demonstrated a capability to play this game. And I think what it means for East Asia more than anything else, it's a fertile new set of opportunities if we are willing to look at these opportunities from a different lens than we did in the past. I'll stop here. Thank you.
Great, thank you so much, Nitin. That was fantastic, and there's a lot of ideas here to continue in the discussion. So as all of you collect your thoughts, maybe I can start with a couple of ideas and questions, and then see where we go from there. Firstly, I was really struck by your description of these two information orders, and how constraining they are for other countries across the world. Now, one way in which some countries have the ability to respond and are doing so is coming up with laws, right? Regulations and frameworks to deal with both these massive technological powers. Now, India has been trying to do that in some areas on data. The government has been struggling to come up with a framework, and there's hope that it's going to pass sometime soon. Cybersecurity, there's, again, discussions on how the architecture in India should be revamped, restructured, and the strategy will hopefully come out soon. There are other areas, social media, there's been some work, IT guidelines, intermediary guidelines. You didn't talk about the regulatory rules aspect of it. Can India do much? Can India play a more important role in terms of figuring out how countries in the global south, across the world, deal with big tech, deal with China, deal with all these other massively powerful actors going ahead. So that's one question. And also because India has had some experience here and is trying to deal with all these questions, issues at home. Second, you mentioned that there's a difference between open and, in terms of information order, there's a struggle, a tussle between closed and open. I'm just wondering where you see India falling along this binary, or is this more complicated than a binary itself? Because from what I can see and what I can gather, the government and the state, the Indian state, has a lot of interests and objectives in terms of the technological development and what they would like to use the different kinds of digital infrastructures for. And you mentioned health, education, so on and so forth. And you can deliver subsidies through some of these infrastructures. Financial inclusion is another major objective. Are you worried that India is kind of moving, or the Indian model here is paving the path toward a more state-led kind of technological governance that has implications for privacy, civil rights, digital, for users online, so on and so forth? So it's not. So where does India fall? It's between closed and open. It's creating this massive statist technological infrastructure, and how do you see that going?
Okay,
Thanks.
I'll take the second one first. There's no doubt in my mind that India is very clearly in the open and free category of information orders. And it's not because of anything which a government does or doesn't do. It's to do with the nature of society. It's very hard to go and put ideological blinkers on people in India because they don't stand. The society is plural, and pluralism and diversity makes it very hard to sustain any ideological firewall, right? So it's very clearly in the open and free category. And this is not inconsistent with government building infrastructure, right? If you look at digital infrastructure to deliver public services as roads, highways, railway lines, airports, well, government builds infrastructure everywhere, right? And I think it's to do, I have colleagues in Takshashila, and I myself, who I'm strongly in the free market camp, and that part of it still says, is there a market failure? Why does the government have to come in, right? That's a fair argument. But empirically, most roads around the world are built by governments. Because roads also, in addition from being an economic lifeblood, they're also ways to deliver public services, right? Many places, healthcare is delivered by the government, right? If you look at something as infrastructure, which means that everyone ought to have it, right? And it's on the basis of, in a way, you include everyone because they have infrastructure, right? If you have a road network, it's infrastructure, it reaches everyone in the country, and then you can bring prosperity. In a way, of infrastructure is inclusion. And the state does have a role to play in that. So I will pick a fight with my free market colleagues in Takshashila and contend that yes, just because we believe in free markets doesn't mean that the government shouldn't build infrastructure. If the government builds infrastructure, builds it well, accelerates its development, and has a sustainable business model for running that infrastructure, there's nothing like it. So I don't think there's a problem. And linked to the first question, I think the models of regulation India chooses will be of great use to the rest of the world. Because there are very few countries who are in the kind of situation that we are in, right? Here's, look at it this way. And I'm oversimplifying it, and a lot of Europeans are probably going to get upset by what I said, especially because you're streaming this. But if you're Europe, right, you're a continent of rich people. You don't really have a big IT industry. So what do? You want to protect your market. So you can have all kinds of regulations. You want GDPR, this, that, and the other, because you have no company who's making money out of these people, right? You have no domestic company making money out of these people. You have foreign companies. So, okay, I'll put these regulations, and the guys who are going to suffer are Apple, Google, Amazon, who are all American companies. So Europe can do that. The Americans say, look, we have a lot of great companies like Apple, Google, Microsoft. We don't want to do anything which will, make them less competitive. So let's not have any laws on them. And it also happens that, the US has a culture of laissez-faire, so not imposing regulations. So it comes nicely and says, the US says, no, we're not going to bother with too many regulations, right? And then you have a country like India, which seems to have both, which has a huge market and a growing market, and which also has a world-class technology industry, right? Now you're in a situation where you can't say I'm going to protect my consumer because you have companies, and nor can you say that, look, I'm going to give these guys a free pass because you also have customers. So you're in the middle, and that is why a lot of tech policy in India is hard, because you are balancing. You're probably unique in this. India is probably unique. Singapore probably comes close, because it has a strong innovation economy. It has a rich and prosperous market. Well, okay, this market is not big in size, but it's a rich and prosperous market. So you have a similar kind of evolving technology policy which satisfies an economy where there are rich consumers, competitive, entrepreneurial, world-class companies is hard to do. I've been there. I've been in this business before. It's very hard to do. So I'm not surprised that it's taking longer for India. But geopolitically, which what I was talking about today, that's a sideshow, right? Because the sovereign expression of what India is doing has very little to do with how we sort out our domestic political and policy issues. The sovereign effects are exactly this, right? Which I mean, is a third country a partner in the sense that it helps us to build our strength or manage our risks? And to what extent is a third country a partner? That's the sovereign, external dimension of it.
Okay, so any questions?
Yeah, I like your analogy.
Oh, just wait a minute. Yeah, it's recording. So just please introduce yourself and just.
Sumana Rajaratnam from the Economist Intelligence Unit. I like your analogy in the beginning about the consequences of the Russia-Ukraine war and the US companies sort of turning off the lights there. And you could draw that analogy in a very similar way to what happened with TikTok, right? Because it wasn't just TikTok, it was also all the other 150 or 200 Chinese apps. I want to ask, what are the risks of setting economic policy that is state-led like that? What does India stand to miss out? And not from the services industry, which India is very good at, but more from the manufacturing standpoint, which if India is truly going to rise and have influence in the world, that industry will need to take off, but it's been flat. So essentially the question is, what are the risks of state-led industrial strategy that is very geopolitically influenced?
It's a very interesting situation, right? Because if you look at the trade and the technology war, there is definitely an interest on the part of the world's companies to diversify out of China, right? Whether you call it China plus one or supply chain diversification, whatever you want to call it. So there is a sense that you don't want to put all the eggs in one basket. So where do you put your, what's your choice? Your immediate choice after the trade war started was Mexico. I'm talking from, for the United States. Your short-term choice was Vietnam. Vietnam has been the biggest winner of the trade war so far. And the medium to longer-term choice is India, because it will take that long for the Indian manufacturing sector to catch up, in terms of productivity levels, in terms of capital absorption levels, in terms of even just finding land, resources, etc. So you're talking about a medium-term, 3-5 year kind of time frame, and it's sort of, you've seen green springs of this with Apple trying to produce iPhones in India and so on. So that's the good side, right? But we also know that if this business of self-reliance goes too far, everybody is going to start beggaring their neighbor, right? And you will also do your own self-reliance and build everything at home. And the contraction of global trade and especially in terms of direct investment in manufacturing, if that contracts, then it's going to be bad for you, right? So that's the situation we're in. Right? There are headwinds which are good. They're pushing you in the right direction, but an overkill there can cause more harm than it does good. So I mean, I've never been a believer in do everything at home. Right? I mean, the combined genius of people around the world is much more than how many ever great engineers you can have in Bangalore. Right? So there are great engineers around me in Bangalore. So it's not like there are, I mean, one of the reasons we are in Bangalore is that, I mean, you throw a stone and you get an expert in an area which you want, right? So it's that easy, or that's the kind of numbers we are talking about. But even those numbers fall short in comparison to the kind of genius that are around the world. So we should hope that as India's manufacturing capability and industry takes off, the government also takes a more relaxed approach towards globalization.
Thank you. My name is Shyam. I'm a Takshashila alumnus. Thank you, ISAS, for hosting, so not part of ISAS. My question is more about the way you frame this particular industry in technology, and it's so broad, right? Even in the past, we could use that as moniker for everything, but today there are just so many wide aspects of it. And you claim, in a way, that it's a strategic interest because there's political capital, not just economic power behind it. So when you look at the things that we are doing specifically in the areas you mentioned, so open digital ecosystems, etc., what about climate tech or energy tech? And that space, and how do you see India's role shifting, not shifting, or in the language you use, building strength, protecting risk, because there's definitely risks, existential, that India itself is facing. So how do you see that in this landscape of technology?
Climate is one thing that, from the Prime Minister down to the little kid in your backyard, everybody is talking about climate, and not talking. They're doing things about climate, right? And they're serious about it. It's sometimes it's startling to see this level of climate action in a country which probably ought not to take it that seriously. Now, this seems very. I mean, when I say this, a lot of climate people get very upset, right? But you're looking at a country which still has about 200 million poor people, right? You're making great strides in one end. You still have a lot of people. And I don't think a climate strategy is going to be necessarily easily going to get them out of that trap, right? So you need to do what you need to do to get people out of poverty today. But I'm in a big minority in this in the country. Almost everybody believes that green tech is not only a way to solve the world's climate problems, but is also a way for us to solve our developmental challenges. Right? I have doubts about the latter, but this is the prevailing thing. I just wrote a piece about climate anxiety in India. There's a study done by Hickman and Marx. They polled teenagers and young people around the world in terms of how anxious are you about climate change. And is your anxiety causing you to, is it impacting your day-to-day functioning? The most serious response is from India. Right? 3/4 of young people said that it's impairing their functioning. 3/4 of young people said they're very anxious or anxious about climate change. This is probably double that of the United States. Right? So, and where young people think that's where investment and action happens, right? Your startup is going to be a clean tech startup. I mean, I look at it in Bangalore. I think the last 2 to 3 years, almost every new startup story has a very strong climate dimension. People are building electric cars. People are building electric vehicles. People are building autonomous cars. It's all across the period. It's not just clean energy, right? It's also using clean tech for your economy.
And do you see that as an export, the way we were talking about regulations, and so when you look at countries in Africa, etc., do you see India shaping that conversation?
Well, I suppose India's role, at least in the next few years, in the short term, will be one of example, right? I mean, if you're looking at somebody building electric scooters across the country, people building electric transportation across the country, changing your railway systems from diesel to electric within a very, very, very short period of time. So these are kinds of things which stand out as an example and tell everybody else that you can do this. I don't think Indian industry is going to do that in the short term. right? Because India is huge, right? You're still talking about 1.4 billion people, 30 states. So it's still a lot of space, lot of, just look at it, a lot of space to grow in India, and you've hardly uncovered that. So why would you step out of the country that early?
Thanks very much for sharing your views, Nitin. I'm Nazia from Ministry of Communications and Information.
Oh, my former, of Singapore, right?
Yes.
Yes, my former ministry. I used to work for
IMDA.
that ministry.
Okay. So I just have two questions. One is on data. So India is historically known to be quite protectionist in this space, right? But recently they have retabled the data protection bill, and there's actually a provision to look at whitelisting countries, which now they are calling blacklisting countries. But the idea is that to be able to identify a set to either allow cross-border data flows with or not allow cross-border data flows with, right? So we're seeing a bit of a shift, isn't it? So previously from being protectionist, now there is a glimpse of openness here. Just wanted to get your views on what's possibly driving this, specifically in this area of data, and also what's the tech industry's views on this as well?
See, I wouldn't use the word protectionist, right? Because what we saw in the last 5-7 years is an exercise of prudence. Because India is, as I said, it's a free and open society. And you could be exfiltrating data for a whole lot of things. I'll give you an example. There's a company called Beijing Genomics, right? BGI, I think it's one of the largest companies in the world. And it was doing genetic tests on Indian citizens, taking advantage of the fact that there were certain laws in India which prohibited Indian companies from doing certain tests. For example, gender determination is, you can't declare gender in, when you do a genetic test in India, you can't disclose the gender of a unborn child, of a fetus. But BGI would do these tests in third countries and exfiltrate the data, right? Now, you would end up with a very detailed profile of the Indian population at a genetic level, and you don't know how you're going to use that data, right? Or it could be Facebook, right? We saw with Cambridge Analytica and other things. You could be Facebook. You have a very, very detailed profile of how an Indian consumer or an Indian person works. And you might have that far more than your own companies do in your country, right? So that's an imbalance you're creating. So I think the crackdown, or what you call protectionism, or it was an act of prudence to say, hey guys, let's just hold this thing before we figure out, as we figure out what to do next, right? So it was more of a holding operation than protectionism implies that there is a philosophy which says all data should be local, right? It was a holding operation because a free and open society can't keep all that data closed, right? Now, you're absolutely right in terms of the whitelisting as an option. And I think it's a great idea because, as I said, it's about bubbles of trust, right? If you want to have a data sharing, the MAS does this also, right? Financial information was always like that. You share it with trusted partners. The US and its allies have a Five Eyes intelligence sharing arrangements because you share intelligence with the four other countries whom you trust. So, starting with bubbles of trust, establishing norms of data sharing, building trust on data sharing with each other, and then slowly expanding those bubbles of trust, I think is a way to go. I think Quad is a great starting point because, that trust at the highest geopolitical level has been made, right? So you have the United States, you have Japan, you have Australia and India. You don't have Singapore yet. But once you have trust established at geopolitical level, you can open data, you have sharing, you build confidence that, data can be shared, it's not going to be bad, it's going to be reciprocal, right? It's not going to be one-sided. And then you can expand those arrangements, you can increase your whitelist as time goes on. In the stage we are in, given the contestation out there, I think being completely open is not a very prudent thing to do, right? It's a prisoner's dilemma kind of thing, right? Until you're sure that everybody is going to cooperate, it doesn't make sense for you to cooperate.
I think initially, I think the industry was also of the view that because India is so big, if they allow data to flow out, what's in it for them? So there was that thinking as well, I think, from industry standpoint.
That's right, both from a strategic and from an economic perspective, yes. And you'll find Indian companies are quite supportive of the government's policy on this. Most Indian companies tend to be very supportive of the government's policy on this. But of course, right? But of course, it's understandable, yeah.
Okay, if it's all right, maybe I'll ask another question on Open RAN. Okay, so you mentioned Open RAN earlier, on network infrastructure. I mean, there are pros to Open RAN, and there's identified concerns as well from a security standpoint, etc. Just wanted to get your views. What's the future of Open RAN in India? What would the approach be?
I would enlarge that question and say that open technology is going to be strategic to India, right? In all domains. We've done some work on this. We call it open tech, whether it's open RAN, open, public digital infrastructure, open source software, open source semiconductor design, semiconductor model, RISC-V kind of strategy. So wherever there's open, it allows India to have a competitive edge because the economy can work with that open and create value out of it, right? So you have the capability to take that open technology and create products, services, and generate economic value out of it. And the beauty of that open methodology is that you're not beholden to anybody, right? You don't have the problem of someone turning the lights off, nor are you paying royalties to somebody else, So in general, that's a great thing. And as far as Open RAN is concerned, the more it is deployed in India, the more it will develop, right? Because if you look at the kind of environments our telcos operate in and the kinds of customer bases that they have, the geographies that they have, if they optimize for India, and if that optimization knowledge is out there, it's going to develop Open RAN much more than any other place.
And the security concerns?
Yeah, we'll figure it out.
And I'm with ISAS. I'm not a specialist I don't work on this area, but I just a couple of fundamental questions. So one, related to the sort of the question on sort of green technology, etc. But this is somewhat allied to that. On the question of the environment, there's something as fundamental as, say, clean air. Seems to be a problem in India, right? So why do you think, given all the sort of advances that you've talked about, it's easy to say it's a political issue, but that's, everything is political. So what do you see as the sort of major constraints as to, why we, like all our, I think Bangalore might be a bit of an exception in the south, but most of our cities are probably one of the more polluted places in the world. That's one. And the second is, the question of data. Again, I think there have been a lot of advances on data and, of course, the digital protection bill, etc. But we've also seen somewhat of a regression on the quality of data, concerns raised by different statisticians, economists, and even something as basic as, say, the census, the 2021 census, the decennial, of course, was delayed by the pandemic, but we still don't have the census results out, which is, the census is the sort of backbone for doing all kinds of policy. So what do you think, again, is the sort of obstacle or constraint in terms of, something like, as basic as the census, which has been happening since, 1831?
Right. Yeah, see, the first one is fairly easy to answer, right? I mean, it's not an excuse, it's not an apology, but it's an explanation. The explanation is this, that when any economy is in the stage of high growth, you will have the environment as a negative externality. The Thames used to be, and there used to be one professor who told me that in the 18th century, you could throw a matchstick into the river Thames and you could catch fire, right? And there was sewage, and cholera, the first epidemic in cholera in London and all of that. And we saw this in China with massive depredations to their natural resources, and it's happening in India as well, right? The explanation, I think, runs this way, is that when people figure out that there is an opportunity to make material gains, even small or big, when there's an opportunity, so sort of historic opportunity to make material gains, they choose that. And they sort of worry about pollution and beauty and all of that later, right? Make money first and let's worry about beauty later. It seems to be the way human beings work. My complaint is not so much, I totally agree with you, right? Delhi especially has had terrible, but Beijing's air pollution used to be quite famous 15 years ago. So it's not that it's unusual, it's unacceptable, but it's not unusual, right? And my sense is that as significant amounts of people enter middle income category, they start worrying about pollution, and then that has a corrective effect on it. In that sense, it will be a domestic pressure which will cause India to solve the problem rather than anything else. And maybe we are 5 years away from it, right? Maybe. On the second part about quality of internal data, I think we have a government which has its own view of what kind of data should come out, how should it come out, and what should the data be probably. And it's an exercise of power, right? It's an exercise of power in politics. It affects certain kinds of data like governments, like census, GDP growth, and so on. But I don't think it matters beyond a point for any practical purpose, right? Hong Kong could carry on without a census, right? India carries on without. In fact, my joke is that, we didn't have a city corporation in Bangalore for the last 2 years for some weird reasons. The city of Bangalore seems to be carrying on as normal, right? So do we really need the city corporation at all? So some kinds of data probably are not necessary. They can make a big difference in terms of the quality of knowledge you have about the economy. But in quotidian terms, in practical terms, does it matter? I don't know. Do I want better data? Do you think we should have better data as a policy wonk? Yes, certainly. We do better quality data, more credible data, more timely data. But I don't know whether it's mission critical.
I'm Kedar Wagle. I'm a portfolio manager. My question was on state capacity. When you talk about India's response to the technology conflict, and you talk about also setting up public digital infrastructure, UPI, now ONDC, the health stack. Is the state capacity, you think, enough to do all this stuff? And based on your experience, is that improving, worsening?
Yeah.
Thank you.
You've nailed it. I think the big challenge in India is capacity. It's a paradoxical thing. We have the largest supply of trained manpower in almost any industry, but we also have the largest amount of shortages in those industries. Right? Semiconductors, IT, right? We have a shortage of manpower in IT. So we have a shortage of capacity in government as well, all levels of government. I would answer it in two ways, right? In some areas like technology, where there's a disproportionate effect in terms of what capacity does, right? So small policy changes, because you're just playing around with policy changes. You don't have to go and do things on the ground. So few people sitting in fewer places can make big differences. So technology is one of them. So yes, there's a capacity shortage in the thing, but relative to the others, it's not as constrained. But if you're talking about fixing rural sanitation, then your capacity constraint is severe, right? You need people with the kind of capacity to go to rural areas to fix. It's a binding constraint. In technology, in financial markets, in the area that you work in, yes, things could be faster, some applications could be cleared faster if you had more people and so on. But I don't think it's a binding constraint.
I'm Ramita. I'm an analyst at ISAS. So I wanted to ask you about the tech cooperation between India and US. So recently, they signed the Initiative on Critical and Emerging Technology, and so most of the analysis that I was able to find at the time, just ascribes it to as a response to China. So, I found it interesting how you spoke about the 3 tectonic shifts, and so how much do you ascribe such kind of cooperation to the China factor versus the other things that you mentioned? And how do you see China responding? And do you also, third question is, do you also see India cooperating with other regional countries on such issues?
Can we just take one more question?
Sure.
Hi Nitin. My name is Khyati and I'm an Takshashila alumnus. So I was keen to know what are your views about the development in AI? Do you see that that's an area that can become a threat for the tech service industry in India, or it can be an opportunity? Thank you.
Yeah. Okay, the first one about the India-US cooperation. I think the fact that the 2 national security advisors sat down and said, look, we have something called critical and emerging technologies as part of our agenda, tells you something, right? It's, for the first time, it's surfaced there. Usually you had India-US thing, it would either be with the Commerce Ministry or the Technology Ministries, maybe the Ministry of External Affairs. These are the ministries which are looking. But the fact that the 2 national security advisors took an interest in it is a clear indication of its geopolitical importance, right? Because it cuts across almost everything which the national security advisors do, right? There's a counter-terrorism dimension, there's a financial, FATF-related terror financing dimension, there is a life sciences and genetic information dimension, the whole of it, right? And there's information warfare. So at this point, I've never been in that room, so it's been done behind closed doors. My assessment is that it's a recognition that the NSAs and the NSA's teams have to take this up more than any substantive agenda item which is on them, right? It's saying that this is something, guys, we've got to look at, right? It's not something which only the other ministries do. It's also what the NSAs do. Beyond that, I don't think we've seen much in terms of an agenda. Kathy, your question on AI. Like everything, it's both, right? Because you do have a lot of startups in the AI space, a lot more startups claiming to be in the AI space, but there are very, very serious companies we've seen who are in the AI space who have potential to do very, very interesting things in the coming few years. But at the same time, there is also the concern that it can make old style software development jobs redundant, right? That you don't need to write code anymore, because the machine will write the code for you. You don't need to verify humans to verify the code anymore, because the machine can do that better than you. I think that's true. It is definitely going to eat jobs at the lower end. But here's the thing. You might not feel it as much as you fear it, right? Because I remember when BPO jobs, business process outsourcing jobs and call center jobs, which came to Bangalore in about 2001, 2002, it's about 20 years ago, when they first came, and I think the Philippines and others started also entering the game, and people started wondering, what happens to these people once these jobs leave? Because these jobs are not going to be with us forever, right? We might have a huge crisis of unemployment on our hands. Or what after the Y2K problem is solved, right? Okay, a lot of people are doing Y2K. Now the Y2K problem is solved. What happens to those people? Are they going to be unemployed? People were worried about it. Strangely enough, none of that happened, right? Because I think people find ways to move up the value chain. So individuals and companies and investors go higher and higher up the value chain as the lower end gets, commoditized or mechanized. I think the same will happen to the IT industry.
Yeah, a quick follow-up. So do you think the big giants right now in the IT industry, in the Indian IT industry, are they capable, or you see that them pivoting towards that direction to save their own revenues, or do you see that the challenge to that will come from completely new set of companies?
Yeah, I think if I'm a shareholder of these companies, that's the question I would ask, right? I think that's an existential question they're all asking themselves. I think the top companies will survive. right? I think they are far. I mean, they're working at levels of technology which is at an entirely different scale. And some of the smaller ones also will survive because they're nimble enough to change. I think it's the mid-sized companies that we have to think of. Can they, if they were doing commodity businesses on a large scale, very small margins, not great in terms of innovation, but it's really a manpower game. I think those kind of companies probably will have to fold.
Thank you.
I wanted to ask again about the regulatory environment. So you drew that interesting comparison between GDPR and EU characteristics and the US laissez-faire model. And you talked a little bit about regulation with Indian characteristics. So what does that look like? And is that a model that you think could be exported to countries in Southeast Asia?
Well, I am very wary of that word export, right? Because I think contexts matter a lot. And that's something which I learned as a student of public policy, as a practitioner of public policy. Contexts matter a lot. Even if you share the same legal system, the same parliamentary democracy, time, place, people change, right? And if you're not accounting for those changes, then exporting, just taking that, literally changing that really doesn't change. So I don't know whether such a model can be exported, but such a model can definitely be, the conversation and the thinking behind that model can help other countries create their own regulatory structures, right? Because otherwise you're looking for, templates on which to do this, right? And if you're a Southeast Asian country, you look at how Europe is doing this. It says this doesn't, the European template just doesn't work for us. Now look at how the US is doing it. It says this template doesn't work for us either, right? So we need something else. And the Indian model is something else. Now, if you study that enough and see what are the various issues which they're worried about, privacy, national development, maturity of national security issues, all of that, right? And say, is there something here we can use? Right? I don't think it's a wholesale export kind of thing.
I have a couple of more questions, if you can indulge. The first question I was hoping you could speak a little bit more about China and the relationship between Chinese tech and Indian tech. Before Galwan, there was a pretty robust interaction exchange between Chinese tech companies like Alibaba, Tencent, Xiaomi, and a lot of the upcoming Indian startups and unicorns. Billions of dollars were invested in India's digital economy. Obviously, since Galwan, there's been a lot of resistance, and some of that has dried up. The government has shifted gears on this issue. What's the sentiment from Bangalore? How is the Indian tech sector looking at Chinese tech, and do they want to engage these Chinese tech companies more at some point in time? The second question, you talked a lot about the Quad and what the Quad is doing on the semiconductor side. The Quad has a tech pillar now, and they meet often. They're talking about ORAN, cybersecurity, other issues. Is Indian diplomacy broadly geared well enough to deal with the range of technological challenges that await India? What needs to happen there? There's a division called NEST now within the MEA. That is involved in a lot of the diplomatic discussions around the internet, around data, cybersecurity. What is your assessment of how NEST is functioning? Is there a need to, I know there's some folks have called for tech ambassadors, for high-level officials to deal with specific tech issues. How should Indian diplomacy change going ahead to deal with this tech order?
Okay. Let me do the first one, right? First one first. See, in 2009 and 10, I was still making the argument that in this coming contest between the United States and China, India should be the swing state. India should be the swing power. We should have better relations with the United States and China than they have with each other. And so that, we don't have to take sides, but we'll be somewhere equidistant, or I mean, we may not be equidistant, but we'll swing as the issues go. That argument became untenable after Xi Jinping came to power and changed the nature of that relationship. The assumption there is that you have leadership in China that is interested in maintaining amicable relations with India, right? You might not have to solve the problems which you have, but at least maintain amicable relations. And the signals from Beijing, even before Galwan, were not there, right? So when you have an outright confrontation happening on your borders, it's like asking the Ukrainians to, buy Russian software. They won't do that, right? I mean, it's a conflict. I mean, the amount of ordnance going across might not be as much as it's happening between Russia and Ukraine, but you have a live border. You have armed forces confronting each other, and this is happening. And it happened in the South China Sea. Nobody protested. Right? Nobody did anything. And I think they got the message that, look, we can move forward and nobody is going to stop us, so we'll do that in the Himalayas as well. And then the Indian army came and stopped that, right? So that's the India-China relationship. But when you're in that kind of a relationship, I think conversations about allowing technology investments and other things just become secondary to your overall political posture with respect to the other state. Now, there were good things about Chinese companies, right? There were good things. Many investors and companies who work with their Chinese counterparts tell you that, the Chinese investors understand regional markets much better than the American ones. Much of the Chinese tech which comes in is somehow they've thought through conditions which are similar to those of India, so so they work. So I can understand, and there was a lot of good investment coming in, right? So there were a lot of good Chinese investors. It's not that all Chinese investors are playthings of the Chinese Communist Party, but when you have a political relationship which is, if I don't have to mince words, you're at war. You're at war in everything but name. So you can't have a normal, economic relationship with the Chinese. So that's the problem. And I think the ball is entirely in Beijing's court, right? It was an overstepping, which is an aggressive, belligerent position, which even some of the, until this came along, there were lots of people in Delhi said, look, we've got to stay in between the United States and China. I used to say, look, all of us have half the family in the United States, right? We have nobody in China. We should be pro-United States. I said, no. Geopolitically, we should be in the middle. But that argument is dead. And I think Beijing can rescue that argument, but I don't know whether they're interested. That's the first. I forget the second one. Oh yeah. Now, the good news is, and I think that was Kedar's question of capacity as well, and I forgot to answer it when he asked it. I think there's public-private partnership going on with respect to tech governance, right? It might not necessarily be in the most transparent. It might not necessarily be in the most constitutionally rigorous form. But the nature of the beast is such that you need to get things going, right? You need to have capacity thrown in at this point. You can't wait for some structure to come in. So I think there's a lot of public-private partnership going between companies. There are a lot of individuals, there are a lot of companies, civil society organizing, working with government to address some of those issues. And the MEA, for example, as you said, has increased the number of officers it has to deal with this. But MEA, if you look at MEA as a classic example, they are very, very short staff. They could go 10x. You could have 10x more people in the headquarters of the Ministry of External Affairs, and you would still be understaffed. But yeah, but that's the pathology of the Indian civil service is an entirely another game. It's a debate for another day.
So combining those two answers, when you say the ball is in China's court, if they choose to play the game we want, in a sense, and the game we constituting as a global we, not just as an Indian we, and say, okay, we're back to strategic ambiguity, is there the speed and capacity of Indian diplomacy to shift back to where you were saying you can be the swing power and generate the kind of collaboration which would be healthy in other spaces? Or are we too far away from being able to swing back?
see, the thing which we all have to remember is that we have the longest border with China. They are a neighbor, right? They are not a country which is 5,000 kilometers away, separated by sea or whatever. It's not a abstract geopolitical entity on the other side. It's a neighboring country. So you do need to have good relationship with the neighboring country, right? That's good for them, it's good for us, it's good for everybody else. And if there's an opportunity where you can have good neighborly relations, regardless of what else happens in the world, you have to grab that. You have to grab that in the fullness of your experience of the past, right? So you have to be wiser, but it would be very, very, I think, imprudent to miss an opportunity to shake hands, should that happen. Well, whether that happens or not is another story, right? But if there is a hand extended from the other side, I think India should. I don't think there's any section of Indian opinion which says that we shouldn't do that. It's just a question of how much and when and to what extent and all of that, right?
Yep. The last question.
Hi, my name is Divya. I'm a research analyst at the Institute. Thank you for your talk. My question is more like something that bounced off on your response to Dr. Sen's question on data, where you said that it seems that presently in India there seems to be a government that seems to decide what kind of data is right. I also remember in the very beginning when you responded to Karthik's question on where you think India stands in the two information systems that you defined, open or closed, you said it comes under open. So it just got me thinking, I'm just curious to know, how are you defining the open information system? What does it actually mean, or how do you want to actually give it an explanation?
Thanks. I think it's a good question. See, the state is just one aspect of Indian society, right? And we've always had state information. We've always questioned state information. Right? I mean, for example, dengue even before COVID, right? Every year, the number of dengue cases in Bangalore would be 50, 100, 120. That's the number which is officially there. We all knew the number was like 10 times or 100 times more than that. Right? I mean, we just look around, dengue cases are happening, right? But you wouldn't get that from the government. But society knew and society adapted to it, right? It's not like people believed that there are only 80 dengue cases and they didn't take adequate precautions, right? So there is a state and there's a state information, apparatus and a information order, and then there's a national information order of which the state is one part. And when I say we are free and open, what I mean is that the national one is open. So even now, even if you get some information from even COVID, I think the EIU person was not here, right? He was here just now, but he left. But if the government tells you that COVID data is, so many people died, EIU has these estimates. Nobody stopped these. I know the EIU's estimates, right? So it's not that anybody blocked me from accessing EIU's estimate. So that's what I mean by open. So society can make up its mind and makes its own decisions based on the number of data sources available to it. And to talk about GDP, right? There's a lot of people who now use nighttime luminosity to look at economic growth. So they don't really look at what governments are. You don't have state level GDP anywhere. You don't have city level GDP in India. Nobody gives you that. You take a satellite image, look at how bright the city is at night, and then you infer that from that. So it works. So it's a free and open order. So, I mean, as a person who has distrust of government in general, being a free market person, I love this. Distrust everything, right? Make up your own mind based on which all the sources of data that you get. Cross-verify everything and make up your own mind.
Great. Thank you so much, Nitin. That was fantastic. You've given us a lot to think about. The masterful survey of trade, technological, and different, and how different orders are forming in this part of the world, and how India is responding to that. Please join me in giving Nitin a hand, and thank you again.
Thank you. It's a pleasure being here. Thank you.